There was no evidence that Mr. Noriega was involved in drugs, no hard evidence until we indicted him.
Does the NSA collect any type of data at all on millions or hundreds of millions of Americans?
No, sir.
It does not.
Not wittingly.
Have we ever tried to meddle in other countries' elections?
Oh, probably, but it was for the good of the system.
Oh, we don't mess around other people's elections, Jim.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Rackets Podcast. I'm your host, Brian Sadie. On this podcast, we discuss a number of topics related to rackets, such as drug cartels, mafia families, crony capitalism, corruption, all types of news events. And the first story has to do with the Arizona State Prison. By that I'm referring to them banning a book called Chokehold Policing Black Men. It's a fairly provocative title, but the content is in no way really provocative. It's actually written by a former federal prosecutor. His name's Paul Butler. He is himself a black man. And it's a really very intellectually honest book that touches upon a lot of really controversial aspects of the criminal justice system. It isn't entirely focused on the disproportionate way in which black people have felt the wrath of the criminal justice system. But he also does point out some things that might surprise people. Like, for example, black men are more likely to be shot by a black police officer. At the end of the day, he's just making a very compelling argument that there's a strong inherent bias within the criminal justice system. So again, this is a very reasonable book. It wasn't written by like some sort of extremist or something. Nothing inflammatory like the anarchist cookbook that would teach people how to make a bomb or something in prison. Again, it's just and it was banned in the Arizona State Prison. And again, I think it's just part of an overall arching theme with the prison system that we need a much less punitive system, a more humane system. With that said, it's kind of one of the contradictions that I like to point out with my work, that I'm not one for abolition of prison, but again, I do think it needs to be dramatically reformed. But on the flip side, I do think that there's this very, very small percentage of the population that really has absolutely no fear of prison, and that, for the lack of a better term, we should just call the social and economic elite. And I think there's a story I kind of wanted to point to. Has to do with David and Joss Sackler. They're the heirs to the Sackler family fortune, which was built upon, through Purdue Pharma with the advent of the drug OxyContin. I don't really need to rehash this in much detail. The marketing of that drug was one of the main drivers of the opioid epidemic. And the Sackler family had been doing this type of aggressive marketing for many years prior. For instance, the drug Valium, that was heavily marketed by Sackler as well. There's just a long, long history there with this sort of profiteering from the Sackler family. Again, I don't need to rehash it in great detail, but that family, again, is responsible for a lot of criminal activity, very high level of criminal activity, but never has actually faced the threat of prison. Not in any real sense. But what that family is starting to face is sort of social backlash. For example, they have given a lot of money back through philanthropy, but a lot of universities and museums, etc., they're facing that sort of social pressure, and they're no longer accepting their donations. And so this social pressure has affected the family so much that David and Joss Sackler decided to sell their $6.5 million apartment, which is in the Upper East Side of Manhattan. And ironically, they're moving to Palm Beach County, which again was sort of the beginning stages of the opioid epidemic. All this family does is face these sort of social pressures. Like if you look into the family and like what's happened to them, it sort of reads like something from the movie Zoolander. What we are starting to see is, like I say, some action by various different groups against Purdue Pharma, that company. And it's coming from some really sketchy characters themselves. For example, J.P. Morgan, and we don't need to rehash their role in the 2008 financial crisis, among a number of other sort of white-collar crimes. But that group has decided to drop them from doing any sort of banking services from them just due to the sort of backlash with their name. But again, we're talking about J.P. Morgan, where essentially they just know that they're immune from prosecution. Elizabeth Warren in her book once mentioned that basically when she was confronting the CEO, Jamie Dimon, about something, he basically just told her, go ahead, hit me with a fine, we can afford it. Again, no fear of any actual criminal prosecution. Also, the really controversial consulting group called McKinsey, I've mentioned them on a prior podcast in relation to this sort of crony capitalist family, the Guptas from South Africa, how they can essentially but it's this consulting firm that it's just represented some of the most corrupt foreign countries, such as Saudi Arabia. They were helping them and sort of in the build-up before Khashoggi was murdered. Again, I'm not insinuating in any way wanted that to happen, but they were, really sort of aggressively targeting different critics of the Saudi, and particularly MBS, the Saudi regime, just with words. Nothing more than that. But again, this company, it just has this sort of very shady reputation. They were deeply involved with Enron during the scandal, but finally at some point, Purdue Pharma has become so flammable that McKinsey Consulting doesn't want to have anything to do with them as well. But again, you've got this major opioid epidemic that a bunch of U.S. corporations have made a ton of money from and have a very complicit role. But at the end of the day, all they do is pay a fine. Every other day, you're reading about another company that gets in trouble. For example, a Louisiana-based distributor called Morrison-Dixon. They just recently reached a $22 million settlement. Apparently, there were over 12,000 different orders that they serviced where there were sort of obvious red flags, and they just looked the other way. In other words, they put profit over ethics. So while we're on the subject of prescription drugs, there was a fairly viral moment. There was AOC when she confronted the CEO of Gilead. It's a company that makes an HIV prevention drug called PrEP. And she was bringing up the point that this drug, it's a very important drug, costs about $1,700 a month in this country. AOC is a pretty polarizing figure. And I hope that people can sort of put aside any sort of feelings about her and just focus on the issue. And I think she brought up a very constructive issue, which is basically the crony capitalism of the U.S. health system. So basically, the U.S. government helped to fund much of the research that went into making this drug. But at the end of the day, the U.S. consumers get very fully inflated prices, whereas a lot of other countries can get these really much lower prices. The drug, I think it was just a fraction of the price in Australia. And the CEO, basically his counter-argument was that they're just sort of following the rules. The U.S., you get a longer period where you can keep the drug from going to generic status, because it is a generic drug there in Australia. But that's actually, I'm sort of building up there for a reason, because I have to point out that there's this major lawsuit, and it's in the state of Connecticut. I believe like 43 states combined in this lawsuit. The defendants are a bunch of these companies that make generic drugs, and just to sort of be concise, essentially the evidence shows that these companies were conspiring together to fix drug prices. They basically acted like a cartel or a mafia. But again, these are just major U.S. corporations where they agree to different market share. In other words, agreeing to not compete against each other in order to raise the prices on the drugs that you and I use every day that we need in order to survive and function properly, so that they can max out their prices. On a totally unrelated story, it's something that I talked about in the prior episode that was solely focused on El Chapo, because one of the top witnesses in that case was the son of El Mayo, who now is basically unofficially the world's most prominent drug trafficker. And nobody really knows who he is. He was sort of like the co-founder there with the Sinaloa cartel. But just to kind of review briefly, his son voluntarily turned himself in and became a major witness against El Chapo. So to this day, I think very few people even know of exactly what the motive was there. I myself do wonder if there was an ulterior motive. Omayo, again, is somebody who sort of lives more in the shadows. But again, Omayo is free and seemingly operating with no problems. And now his son is in the process of coming home. Prosecutors, because they cut that deal with him, it looks like he'll be going home fairly soon. There's also another aspect of just the drug war in particular with Latin America that I wanted to point to. And it's just sort of the way that the news gets spun and the drug war is used really for these sort of geopolitical purposes. No doubt there's a lot of corruption with the Venezuelan government with drugs. I've pointed this out a long time, basically called it a narco-state. But the thing that bothers me is that the U.S. government gives that country a ton of attention. There's a laundry list of people who've been sanctioned, within the Venezuelan government by our government. Meanwhile, there's arguably a more flagrant narco-state in the country of Honduras. Most notably, the brother of the current president of the country was actually left off of recently released a list of Central American government officials who are, suspected of deep ties to the drug trade. And although the president's brother is not actually a government official, but he's actually facing charges. Long story short, very deeply involved in the trade. There have been a number of just different revelations in which the Honduras government was essentially giving different government contracts to different traffickers, basically as a source of laundering of drug money. Just the ties with the drug trade are endless there in Honduras, but you've basically seen no media coverage of it. It's all almost entirely focused there on Venezuela. Again, a lot of that media attention in Venezuela is entirely deserved, but there needs to be a more balanced representation with this media coverage. And the main reason is because the government is the driver, and the government, the U.S. government, firmly has the back of the Honduras government. There was a coup back in 2009 that removed a left-wing leader, and ever since there's just been there have been sort of these right-wing leaders that have these horribly corrupt backgrounds. In fact, the son of the prior president is in prison in the United States on drug trafficking charges. Again, just sort of a laundry list of characters tied to the drug trade in Honduras, and there's basically no real public outcry from the U.S. government. So while we're on the subject of Venezuela, I want to bring up an op-ed that was recently written by Lindsey Graham in the Wall Street Journal, and since then he's done sort of like a media tour. But the title was "Match Words with Action in Venezuela, Mr. President." It was basically his call to action for President Trump to go to war in Venezuela. And for one thing, it just seems that Lindsey Graham doesn't really understand how the Constitution works. If you remember, I had a very good interview with Nathan Smith, who sued the President of the United States about really how the war powers actually work in the United States, at least on paper, how they work in the United States. But no, just as a reminder to Lindsey Graham, Congress has the power to declare war, not the U.S. President. He's somebody who's been very involved in sort of military affairs politically, and he's somebody who should know better. And again, I'm putting aside any of the actual counterproductive or just empirical nature of a demand like that. But Lindsey Graham used to be a military law officer, so he should know these types of things. But again, his one of his rationales is that Trump should invade Venezuela just like how Reagan invaded Grenada. And it's naive on many levels. For one, Grenada is just this tiny country that basically had no military. And again, he's just sort of just unaware of so many things. For example, if you remember, there was that sort of controversial moment where Trump was telling the wife of a deceased soldier, he knew what he was doing. He signed up for it, and that involved a group of troops who were surrounded and killed in Niger. But after the event, Lindsey Graham openly said during an interview that he didn't even know that we had troops in Niger. In other words, we've got so many troops in so many countries that really one of the foremost leaders on national security in the Senate doesn't even know where they all are. And now he wants even more war, of course. Again, the U.S. government just tends to, even if you did support that war, which I don't, and I think that the vast majority of Americans don't, despite, a lot of the really negative news coverage coming out of Venezuela. But there does seem to be some naivete about what extent of a military commitment that we would need in order to achieve this goal. For example, you probably saw that story with John Bolton on his notepad there where it said 5,000 troops to Colombia's border. That number, I do like to point out, again, ties to the drug war, which is roughly the number of U.S. troops who are in Latin America who are stationed there specifically for quote-unquote counter-narcotics operations. But again, back to Graham. He recently sent out a tweet that said, Cuba and Russia send troops to prop up Maduro in Venezuela while we talk and we sanction. Where's our aircraft carrier? So in other words, we don't have an aircraft carrier just looming outside of Venezuela. And this just seems to be an absolute emergency in Lindsey Graham's eyes. And there's a good reason for that. We don't have them there because we have a long history of insurrecting these different military coups throughout Latin America. It's one of the few aspects of progress in U.S. foreign policy, and Lindsey Graham wants to just run roughshod over that type of progress. While we're on the subject of ships, U.S. military ships, I want to point out there was a recent report from the GAO in which they point out that basically $30 billion worth of waste in the U.S. Navy has to do with these littoral combat ships. And basically over the last 15 years, we've spent that much money and we've gotten about 10 ships out of the deal, of which only really 4 are in use, 2 of which are in the Caribbean there, where again there's no military threat. They're basically used to try to basically work in the war on drugs. These big, bulky ships that in no way can actually catch a small speedboat. So again, just a very useless use of our resources. There are 2 of those ships that are basically off of the west coast there. But it just sort of points to this wasteful military-industrial complex. We have this sort of like World War II style of weaponry that we keep spending ridiculous amounts of money on that just don't really serve us well for really the future style of warfare. For example, there have been some stories recently where we're doing these war games, just hypothetical situations where if we went to war with China and Russia, and the results are that we lose badly. We lose really badly, even though we spend a ridiculous amount more in money as far as our military budget. Yet, if we had to go to war with them today, we would not necessarily lose, but we would perform very badly. One of the final topics I wanted to talk about was the former CIA director, Michael Morrell. He was recently on a sort of an Asian geopolitics-focused podcast called Tea Leaves. And he had some very interesting comments, most of which I agree with. And he was talking about Pakistan and India and sort of their rivalry. And this is something I brought up recently on a prior episode involving how there's a bona fide terrorist group in Pakistan called JEM, Jaish-e-Mohammed. They recently committed a number of attacks against India. And basically what Morell's analysis is, and I think most people who follow the region would agree, is that Pakistan gets the label of sort of being a haven for terrorists, but he actually points out that they've essentially invented some different terrorist groups, which in my opinion is pretty accurate, in particular the group LET. But yeah, they were responsible for the 2008 attack in Mumbai. Most of their attacks are sort of in this disputed region of the Kashmir. But again, it was sort of, and it was labeled a terrorist attack. It was a terrorist attack. But at the end of the day, that Mumbai attack was basically a state-sponsored attack. When it first came out that there were reports that within that group that there were former ISI members, the ISI being sort of the Pakistani version of the CIA, that really the masterminds of that attack do remain free in Pakistan. And really the whole reason behind their sort of support of extremists in Afghanistan has to do with that Pakistan doesn't want any sort of neutral or moderate party there in Afghanistan. They want extremists who will see sort of their side in any sort of potential conflict with India. Morrell made a very good point that it's an overdrawn conclusion by Pakistan. India really does seem to be more focused on their economy. But there was one particular quote that I have to mention. He said, what they, and by they he's referring to as Pakistani government leaders, don't realize is that it's impossible to keep those terrorist groups under control. That eventually comes back to bite you. And of course, yeah, that absolutely makes sense. But then you have to think about it. It's almost like I wish I had the record scratch sound effect of, you don't say. Again, this quote is coming from the former director of the CIA. If you're listening to this podcast, I guarantee you are aware of what I'm referring to, and it's all the different type of blowback that has come from the CIA supporting all types of different extremist rebel groups. And just in that region, you can point to the Mujahideen and a host of just different Afghan and Pakistani opium warlords, such as Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, the Haqqani network. You can go on endlessly. They're supporting a number of different opium warlords who have actually been on the CIA payroll, and that's just in that one region of the world. And I guess really the last story I wanted to point to is another example of blowback, and it's not from the CIA. It has to do with the NSA. They had a tool for hacking. It was called Eternal Blue, and it got released a couple years ago, and it's been used against the United States. And currently, the city of Baltimore have a group of hackers that have basically shut down their website, and they're holding it for ransom, demanding, I forget how much money in Bitcoin. But this has been sort of a continual thing, and it all has to do with this hacking tool from the NSA that got released. If you remember a couple years ago, there were these cyber attacks from North Korea. It was called the WannaCry virus. And again, the source of that goes back to Eternal Blue from the NSA. A number of other state actors, such as Russia and China, have used this exact same technology to attack U.S. cyber infrastructure, along with the UK, Germany. A number of countries have faced a lot of real damage as a result of this tool of the NSA being leaked. So I guess that's really sort of the final story for today. I want to thank you for listening. I'm going to have a great guest on the show next week, or at least that's the plan. Stay tuned. Thank you for all your support. If you do want to support the podcast, I ask that you share this on social media in any way that you can. Give it a 5-star rating on whatever platform you use. And really the best way to support the podcast is to go out there and buy a copy of my 3-book series. That's called Rackets. It's on the legalization of drugs and gambling and the decriminalization of prostitution. So until next time, thank you much.
It's a big club, and you ain't in it.
I am concerned that the size of some of these institutions becomes so large that it does become difficult for us to prosecute.
You can have a license. Price is $250,000, plus a monthly payment of 5% of the gross, of all 4 hotels in the store. Corleone.